Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another episode of Robinson Run. I'm your host, Brady Kreitzer. Behind me is a pretty familiar sight for those of us that have been watching the series. We've seen it at the beginning of every episode. This is the Walker Ewing Log Cabin. Now, this is not just another Swedish-style log cabin. This is a very important symbolic place in the history of Robinson Run. Because in the 1790s, Jane Walker, daughter of Isaac Walker, and William Ewing, nephew of Squire James Ewing, who we've studied for so long, will be married. And Isaac Walker will bequeath this cabin to them. This will be the coming together of two of the most prominent families in all of Robinson Run. And it's much greater than just a single marriage. It's an indication of a community on the rise. Robinson Run is no longer a frontier settlement like it used to be 20 years earlier. By the 1790s, Robinson Run is a permanent addition to the new American landscape. Now, what the Ewings and the Walkers and the Scotts, who were all at this wedding, could have never imagined was that at the same time this wedding was occurring, this celebration, this moment of coming together for these two families, the new President George Washington was signing a controversial new law, taxing and regulating the primary product, the primary economic driver of this region, whiskey. Before Pittsburgh was the Steel City, before it was the Iron City, it was the Whiskey City. And Joseph Scott, Gabriel Walker, Isaac Walker, and James Ewing, as well as most of their neighbors, were all highly invested in the production and sale of whiskey. When this wedding occurs, there's celebrating, there's partying, there's joy. What none of the Robinson Run communities could have ever envisioned, though, was that just in a few months, the communities that surrounded it, and Robinson Run included, would be rising up in armed rebellion against the United States of America. In just 4 years, President George Washington, Treasury Secretary Alexander Hamilton, Virginia Governor Light Horse Harry Lee, and Revolutionary War hero Daniel Morgan would be leading an army of 13,000 men to occupy Robinson Run, arrest its residents, imprison them, and charge them all with treason. It's a remarkable story of the event we call the Whiskey Rebellion. Let's head to the office now, lay some groundwork, and dig into what will be an event that spans the next 3 episodes of Robinson Run. Hang tight. All right, everybody, we are back here in the office. One of the things that is really special about Robinson Run is that us following these people's lives takes us through literally 30 years of some of the most important moments of American history. And over the next few episodes, we're going to be beginning our conversation about an event that is little understood, pretty widely known, and has great implications not just for the United States and early America, but for our folks here at Robinson Run as well, because they're going to be critical players in it. And that, of course, is going to be, as the screen says, the Whiskey Rebellion. Now, a few things about the Whiskey Rebellion, if I may. In 2023, I released a book you see here on the screen called The Whiskey Rebellion, a distilled history of an American crisis. And it went to #1 on Amazon.com. It was reviewed in the Wall Street Journal and the Washington Post, and it really changed my life. But I have sort of, become one of the people that really has presented this book in its fullest form here in modern book form. I mean, we've only had 4 books on the Whiskey Rebellion, really, since about 1900. So it's an honor for sure to share it with you. But the Whiskey Rebellion is going to be a very important deal, and it's something I couldn't really dive into in the field, so it's why we're doing it here in the office. Let's talk a little bit about where the Whiskey Rebellion comes from, and then again focus on where our Robinson Run people come in. So as we've seen over the last 17 episodes or so, The Robinson Run community is very indicative of life here on the Western frontier. People bet on themselves, and that's great, but they also rely on the government for support. And as we've seen in the American Revolution, that support just doesn't always come. The Robinson Run community pleaded the new Continental Congress for support and for material protection during the American Revolution, and that didn't happen. But now, of course, we've seen the consequences of that. Native American raids, British allied native warriors literally destroying the entire community, this real intense self-sufficiency emerging amongst them, and a real distrust of the government. And that's not going to go away. Just because the revolution ends doesn't mean these people magically believe in the power of a big government. They do not. So the Robinson Run community has learned the hard way that you have to do for yourselves. And the government isn't always on your side, at least not all the time. But here's a great look at a painting by David Wright of some Scots-Irish frontiersmen, very indicative of the people that we've been following, the Walker brothers, James Ewing, and Joseph Scott here at Robinson Run. So we're going to jump now to the presidency of George Washington. And George Washington has many crises unfolding at the same time during his first 4 years as president and even into his second term for sure. And one of the biggest is that the western frontier, everything over the Appalachian Mountains that we've been studying, really is not part of the American governmental structure yet. And what do I mean by that? Well, they're distrustful of the government, and we can't blame them. They haven't seen that the government can A, protect them, or B, really even care about when they ask for support. So George Washington, who spent a lot of time here in the West, has a real concern that these people over the mountains really don't relate much to their brethren in places like Philadelphia and Boston and Charleston and New York. He's afraid that, as he says, they are like a feather twisting in the wind, and they could easily be turned a different direction. They don't buy into the new Constitution by the year 1790 like a lot of other Americans do, and there's a lot of reasons for that. So George Washington's Treasury Secretary, a guy we'll talk about a lot, named Alexander Hamilton, comes up with a plan. And his plan, quite simply, is to find a way to unify these people in the West with their brethren in the East. And you'll love this. His plan centers around taxation, particularly taxation and regulation of their primary industry out here, which very quickly has emerged as whiskey. Alexander Hamilton is a very popular man today, and for good reason. He's one of the really important founding fathers, but he understood, like George Washington as president, that the big divide between America was not North and South, not the way we think of it throughout the broader sweep of American history, of course, leading to the Civil War. But in early America, the divide was between East and West. And I think that's really important. And I have a new book coming out next year on the National Road, and that's a core tenet of that, but that's a video for another time. So when Alexander Hamilton creates an excise tax on whiskey, excise tax is a tax on a domestically produced good here in America. There's never been one like it before. And he really has two goals with that. Number one, of course, is to collect money, revenue from the people of the West. And I think that'll always be his argument. But number two, and you can see this in Hamilton's papers, is that he really wants to bring the West to heel. People like the Walkers and the Ewings and the Scotts that don't necessarily respect his authority or the authority of the federal government. He believes that if you can tax them and they pay the tax, then that is an implicit admission that the federal government is in charge. If they don't pay the tax, then you're talking about rebellion and sedition and potentially civil war. But if they do pay the tax, Hamilton hopes this will bring them into the fold of American life, whether they like it or not. Alexander Hamilton is Treasury Secretary, and of course, we still have Treasury secretaries today. But what's a little bit different about him is that there's never been a Treasury secretary before. There aren't really rules and guardrails for what a Treasury secretary can do. So for Alexander Hamilton, a New Yorker, he believes he's much more like a prime minister. He believes the American economy is something for him to guide and pilot in the direction that he wants, like moving pieces on a chessboard. He believes that America's future is an investment, buying and selling in the Atlantic world with the great powers of Europe. So all of his attention, all of his efforts, all of his belief are in the East Coast cities with really wealthy people that live in New York and Philadelphia. Rich friends like Robert Morris who can invest millions of dollars. That's who he believes will build America. He doesn't really have faith in the people of the West. He thinks they are at best neutral parties. They don't contribute in his mind to America's greatness. They kind of grow enough food for themselves and, at best do very little. At worst, he thinks they can pull America apart because they don't necessarily subscribe to the American virtues as put forth in the Constitution. Of course, these Westerners will completely disagree with him, and we'll talk about why. So much of this story is going to be in the area you see highlighted in red here, Washington County. But remember, for most of our Robinson Run story, Washington County also included huge chunks of Allegheny County. So that's our Robinson Run crew. When they served in the American Revolution, they didn't serve in the Allegheny County militia. They served in the Washington County militia. So as this Whiskey Rebellion, or what was called in its own time, the Western Insurrection, that's much more frightening, develops, we're going to see the Walkers and the Ewings and the Scotts fall in with their old Washington County cohorts. Many times in their old regiments we saw them in the Revolution, because remember, this is only 7 years after the Revolution ends. That's still their group. That's still their people. And they're going to be a big part of that. So we know Hamilton wants to tax whiskey. We have an understanding of why. He wants to foster national unity, or maybe put the West in its place. But we do have to talk a little bit about whiskey, because everybody we've met so far, James Ewing, Gabriel and Isaac Walker, and even Joseph Scott, who we just met in our last few episodes, are going to be in the whiskey business. So why whiskey, and why is that the way Hamilton believes you can strike a chord or a note with the West? Whenever you think about Western Pennsylvania, I want you to think of it the way that people in the 18th century did. And not just Western Pennsylvania, but Western Virginia, Kentucky, and even parts of Illinois. And when you talk about that area, that's the first West. I know today California and Oregon and Washington are the West, but that area, the Ohio River Valley, is the first West. Whiskey is the center of their economy, because we grew more corn here in the Ohio River Valley than almost anywhere else in the world, and definitely more than anywhere else in America. Corn and rye was the other staple, are easy to grow. But they're not particularly valuable. If you want to sell corn and rye and make any money, which all these Western farmers do, you have to find a way to make it profitable. Now, selling it to Philadelphia and Boston would be great, but you have to sell literally tons of it to make money. And you have to ship it over the mountains, the Appalachians. And that's really expensive. There's a complicated system of ferries and tolls you have to pay. Believe it or not, it's cheaper to sell goods from Philadelphia to London than from Pittsburgh to Philadelphia. It's remarkable, but it's true. And that's the cost of overland travel. Travel by sea, shipment by sea is always much, much cheaper. So what they start to do with their corn is distill it into whiskey. Whiskey is really one of the great holdovers or imports, legacies, that the Scots-Irish bring to America from their original home in the British Isles. Whiskey takes things like corn and grain and makes them very valuable. You can distill corn and grain down into whiskey. Whiskey's cheaper to move, certainly, than tons of corn. And it makes, as a finished product, more money for you. But on top of that, it's completely shelf stable. Whiskey can sit on the shelves for literally years. And not only does it not spoil, but it actually gets better over time. So whiskey becomes the primary driver of the West's economic engine. You know, here in Pittsburgh, before we were the Steel City, we were the Iron City. And before we were the Iron City, we were the Whiskey City. That's what we did here. And when Hamilton made a new tax on whiskey, that was viewed by many in the West as a direct assault on their way of life. What you're seeing here on the screen is a picture from the Heinz History Center of a classic whiskey still of the American frontier. This is about a 10-gallon still, and this was pretty common to see on a lot of farms in this area. Not everyone had one. Usually one person in the neighborhood had a still. Everybody would bring their grain to that person. That person would distill it into whiskey for them, and they'd give them a little cut of the action. But that's how the Western economy worked. Some of the things to remember about whiskey are that it wasn't just something they made here, but it was their actual, in many cases, currency that they had here. So an attack on whiskey by the federal government, a government that has, in the minds of people like the Walkers and the Ewings and the Scotts, a government that has really never done anything for them. It's only asked from them and never given back. You know, they fought the revolution. They were not protected. They were not well supplied. They handled their own business. The government to them was completely futile in most cases of affecting their lives in a positive way. When the government attacks or taxes whiskey, depending, again, how you view it, it's all politics, right? They view it as a direct assault on their way of life. Here's an example. America did not produce its own money in the 1790s. Not yet. They didn't mint coins. They didn't print bills. So when there was money being exchanged in places like Boston and Philadelphia, import-export cities, it was like foreign money, you know, Spanish dollars and British pounds and French francs and livres. I mean, you know, it's all gold and silver, so it all weighs out in the end. But that money very rarely made it over the mountains to the west, where people like the Robinson Run community operate. And we know why. There wasn't a lot of trade there back and forth. So what happened was people in the West developed a barter economy. Meaning, you know, I'll paint your barn, you give me a few barrels of whiskey. I'll help you slaughter your cow, you give me, a couple dozen eggs. You know, currency didn't exist, so what was exchanged was goods and services, and whiskey was a big one. Because again, whiskey will last forever. So people would actually trade whiskey for services here in the West, and they'd even stockpile it in their homes, almost like we would put money in a bank account. Because it never lost value. It only went up and it only got better with time. So when the Whiskey Act is released by Alexander Hamilton in 1791, it's met with immediate concern because Westerners read it as though it's an abusive law. And I think as we'll go through it, you might find that to be true. There were things written into this law which are perplexing. They don't seem fair. They don't seem like they're done in good faith. And if it was just a tax, then that would be fine. But remember, the reality is Hamilton wants to put these people in their place as well as extract revenue from them. He wants to assert the authority of President Washington and the Constitution over these people. So, for example, some of the problems with this law from the Western viewpoint. Number one, if you did not register your still, and that's a still you're seeing here on the screen, that would be a fine of about $250. Now, what does that mean for us? Well, $250 is modest today, but back then that was about 4 years. Where's our camera? 4 years worth of income. Who do you know in this economy or any economy that can lose 4 years of income and remain financially solvent? Really, not many people at all. And that's why they viewed it as so unfair. Even worse, if they were delinquent on their tax, the government would come in and foreclose on their farms and literally take their land from them. And, you know, as much as these people decried the British for their taxes, the British never took anyone's land. You know, they taxed their tea, and look where that got us. You're talking about an outside government in the minds of the West, overarching, too powerful, actually taking their land. That's their prosperity. That's their children's future financial security. And there's other things in this tax that are problematic. The more whiskey you distilled, the less taxes essentially you paid. So there were people, that's a 10-gallon still there. Imagine that to be like the size of a garbage can. There were people with 500-gallon stills, like stills the size of a minivan. And these people not only made a lot of whiskey, but they usually had the contracts for the army in Pittsburgh. Every soldier in the Fort Fayette at the time, got a whiskey ration. Well, these big-time distillers, they got to sell all the whiskey without much work because they had guaranteed no-bid contracts. And most of them, by the way, were loyal to George Washington and Alexander Hamilton's political party, the Federalist Party. These people here in the West really weren't. So they look at this as immediately not only designed to attack their really only means of making a living, but they view it as completely out of the scope of what a government should do. They fought the revolution just like everybody else. They fought for a government of their own, of the people, by the people, for the people. They didn't sign up for this. And this is all kind of getting you into the Western ethos, the Western mindset for what leads to the Whiskey Rebellion. Because men like the Walkers and men like Joseph Scott and his immediate family are going to become major players in this event. And remember, Western newspapers will talk about this event. The Whiskey Rebellion is a 4-year event. It will be the second largest rebellion in American history, domestic rebellion, besides the Civil War of 1861 to 1865. Now, the Whiskey Rebellion, or what newspapers at the time called the Western Insurrection, will last from 1791 to 1795. That's 4 years, just like the Civil War. And this was, make no mistake, the greatest crisis of George Washington's presidency. So, of course, I have a book about it. If you want to read more, I could recommend some decent reading for you, for sure. But here's what's really important, and here's what really initially drew me to this project. Our Robinson Run community is going to be front and center in this movement in a way that few people can really understand, because so few people really understand the Whiskey Rebellion at a local level. If there's one thing I do in my career, it's I like to study the major events of the West from 1750 to 1800, including the French and Indian War, the American Revolution, and the Whiskey Rebellion from a on-the-ground level affecting real people. And that's what we're doing here. That's what Robinson Run is all about. We're not going to talk generally about the quote-unquote Scots-Irish and the quote-unquote Native Americans. We're going to meet these people and see how it affects their lives. They are going to be at the center of the greatest crisis of George Washington's presidency. So our next step, and hang on one second, we'll be there in a moment, is to see how the Walkers and how Joseph Scott really went about protesting this movement early on. And lucky for us here in Pittsburgh, we have just the site where they did it. Hang tight, we'll be there in a second. I am here in Pittsburgh's beautiful and historic West End to talk about the next real critical step for the Robinson Run community and their role in the Whiskey Rebellion. And of course, you can see the building right here behind me, a very special place that's going to be at the center of our story. What you're seeing here is Pittsburgh's famed Old Stone Tavern. This sits right in the heart of Pittsburgh's West End, which is an incredibly historic place in its own right. And the tavern you're seeing here was actually constructed sometime between 1777 and 1782. And this tavern was and still remains, the oldest commercial building in the city of Pittsburgh. It's right at the bottom of the hill here in Pittsburgh's West End. Now, this building is enormously historic. It's been essentially in some kind of operation since the 1780s. And this was a place frequented by everybody who was anybody in the region of Pittsburgh, Allegheny, and Washington County. Part of the reason that the Old Stone Tavern was so vital was because it sat on a very important Native American trail called the
the Catfish Trail. And the Catfish Trail led essentially directly from Washington, PA to Pittsburgh. So everybody visited this place. It was a place where people met and gathered and ate and drank, kind of a classic tavern of the 18th century. And it was a place where people got together and talked about issues of the day. And of course, the big issue of the day in the 1790s was the dreaded Whiskey Act. And this is the place where men like Gabriel Walker and Isaac Walker and Joseph Scott would get together with their friends and neighbors and comrades and talk about how they would resist this new whiskey tax. Because, as I mentioned in the lecture back in the office, it was incredibly damaging to them financially, and they believed a flagrant violation of their constitutional rights. One of the really great things about this building, and it's windy, I apologize, but we're on location, is that there's a group of people called the Friends of the Old Stone Tavern. And they're trying to preserve and save this building, and rightfully so. It's one of the most important historical connections to the 18th century in all of Western Pennsylvania. So I would encourage you to Google them, Friends of the Old Stone Tavern, visit their website, donate some money or some time, that's just as good in the world of public history, and help save this place. But one of the great things about this building is that there was a document inside of it, which was called a tavern ledger. And this tavern ledger was kept by the tavern keeper, and essentially it listed who came through the area, what they were looking for, what they were talking about, if they bought something or sold something. It was kind of a universal place of business. But when you look at that tavern ledger, you're going to see a bunch of names. Again, a who's who of Pittsburgh and the American Revolution and the 18th century. But three names that stand out to you, and I'm going to put them here on the screen. I did all the research for you, of course, are going to be Gabriel Walker, Isaac Walker, and Joseph Scott. And for me as a historian, it's one thing to follow these people and study these people, but it's another thing to literally be able to trace their steps. And in the 1790s, the Walker brothers and Joseph Scott and many other Pittsburghers met in this tavern to debate how they would resist. Some people advocated violent resistance. Some people advocated a peaceful resolution. Much like any political discussion, those conversations were across the board. And ultimately, as we'll see, it's those extremists that are going to win out. Now, where Joseph Scott, Gabriel Walker, and Isaac Walker fall into this, difficult to say. I can tell you, looking at the ledger, men like James Ewing, another member of the Robinson Run community, of course, we've been following, doesn't appear in there. So whether he never came here, which I highly doubt, because everyone did, or whether he didn't participate in these early resistance discussions, I think that may be the key. The Old Stone Tavern here in Pittsburgh's West End is a critical part of this story. So take a drive by, visit it, follow in the footsteps of the Walkers and the Ewings and the Scotts. We're only about 4 miles or less, probably more like 3.5, from Robinson Run itself. So this place is right on their radar. They were here a lot. But do your part to help save this location, because it's not just a critical connection to the American Revolution here in the West, but it's an essential part of the Robinson Run and Whiskey Rebellion story here in the West. So this will wrap up our first episode of the Whiskey Rebellion and Robinson Run. The next episode, we're going to look at how the violent resistance begins and the places where those events occur. So stay tuned. Please share the series. We'll see you next time on Robinson Run.